Heyo, I'm Miss Linnea Lark, and I'm back with part 5 of our tile carving lesson, how to carve and incise texture onto your clay. In our last video, I taught you guys how to relief carve your shapes into overlapping 3D planes. If you want to watch the relief carving video, click the card in the top right of your screen. At this point, all of your shapes should be relief carved, and 3 of your shapes should be overlapping, creating 3 separate planes. All of the lines that we drew initially should be carved away and should now be edges with shadow defining them. Your craftsmanship should also be clean and clear of any clay gunk. At this point, we have 5 or more 3D shapes carved into our tiles. We are going to select at least 3 of these shapes to carve 3 different man-made or natural textures onto. To carve texture, I need to start at the beginning of the carving process. Some of this will be a review for you, but I'll try to make it quick. For this quick demo, I want you to imagine that this square bit of clay is one of the shapes of my tile, and that I'm actually carving the pangolin scales onto one of the shapes that is already carved into my tile. It's just a quick demo. Step 1. Observe your texture reference photo. As you can see, I observed the major shapes of the pangolin scales. I noticed that the scales are overlapping and that each scale is rather pointy on the end. Step 2. I draw the shapes that I observed in my reference photo onto my clay shape. Remember that you have freedom to stylize your drawing. It doesn't need to be hyper-realistic, but it should kind of be obvious what your texture is in the end, if you're doing a good job. Step 3. I relief carve out the shapes so that they are 3D. I carve trenches around the shapes and then fade those trenches out so that the shapes appear to be overlapping each other. I make sure that I carve deep and with an undercut so that each scale is defined by shadow and looks 3D. When I'm done carving my shapes out, I make sure to clean up all my work so that there's no more clay gunk. And that's where our video begins today with step 4, carving movement. Now that we've made our scales 3D and have lots of shadow, we need to add movement. It's important to take another look at our pangolin scales and the reference picture to make sure that we're getting the proper movement. Let's take a moment to observe the movement of the scales. I am noticing that the scales themselves are rather round in shape. They are wrapped around the body of a pangolin, and so the middle of each scale is slightly arched and the sides are a wee bit lower. I'm also noticing that there is a center ridge in the middle on the bottom where all of those little ridges converge. So the scales are rounded with a raised spine in the bottom middle. Now let's observe my relief carved tile. Notice how my background is flat. That's good, it's just the background. But now take a look at the 3 layers of scales. The bottom and middle layers both look pretty dynamic compared to the top layer of scales. Can anyone observe the difference between the bottom 2 layers of scales and the top layer of scales? You might have noticed that the top layer is flat, while the bottom scales are all carved at a diagonal angle so that the scales looked layered on top of each other. This means these inside areas are actually carved deeper than the tips of the scales. They're carved at a diagonal. I carved them on that angle so that I could create an optical illusion that the scales are overlapping each other, and so that there's a more dynamic shadow from the high cliffs at the tips. Because I didn't need the top layer to look like it is beneath another set of scales, it was left flat. But a happy accident of all that diagonal carving is that these deeper areas and high areas together make those scales look more interesting. They have more movement. This is an example of movement. Before we carve any of those lines and ridges, we want to carve the movement we observe in the photo reference onto our shapes. So I begin carving down the outer edges of each scale, leaving an arch and a ridge in the middle. Remember that the more you observe your reference and identify shapes and movement, the more lifelike your carving will look. I didn't notice at the time, but now that I'm editing this video, I am noticing that the ridge I left in the middle is more like a thin vertical shape. But the shape in the raised ridge in the photograph is more like a diamond or teardrop shape. This isn't a big deal. Remember, you can take creative liberties and apply style to your carvings, but it is also true that the better your observation and movement, the more lifelike and potentially better your carvings will look. Isn't it cool to see the difference between flat scales and rounded scales? It's a small thing, but movement makes a difference in a dynamic carving. We're trying to be great, not okay. We're trying to be great. We want that dynamacy. Is that even a word? I don't know. Make sure that your textures, shapes have varied movement to make your carvings look more dynamic. On to the last step, incising details. Before I begin, I take another gander at my pangolin reference. I'm always going back to that reference. I've got the 3D shapes of the scales and some round movement. Now I need all these vertical converging lines and ridges. Incising is basically carving line work or small shapes into the surface of the clay to make it look textured. And the most important thing for you to know about incising is that it is the very last thing that you will carve. Also, please understand that incising lines and details onto the surface does not make your carving 3D, but it is kind of the crowning glory of your textured carvings. It's very important. For this quick example carving, I used a wooden tool because my clay was still super wet. The wooden tools absorb moisture and glide better through wet clay. But to be honest, by the time you get to this stage with your carved tiles, they'll probably be a lot more dry. So it's a good idea to use a wide, sharp, metal-tipped tool. I would avoid using a needle tool for incising whenever possible. Sometimes it's a good tool and the right tool to use, but it is so fine that the needle tool marks are often clogged up by the glaze later and lost in glazing. And because the side of the needle tool is round and not flat, it tends to rip the clay in a gunky way. The scoopy tool with a more flat edge, or even the ball stylus tool, would make a better indentation and wider line. I often prefer to carve my line work deeper and wider than I want them to be in the end, so that I can use a wet paintbrush to smooth out any harsh or ripped edges without completely washing away those details. Notice that when I use a wet paintbrush to smooth my craftsmanship, that all the edges look cleaner. But if I were to overwork my incised areas with too much water and movement from my brush, all of the details would begin to erase and start to look like my carving has been at the bottom of a river for years. It would be overly smooth and hard to see, and there would be very little shadow left. If you go too far with the paintbrush, just etch your lines back in and try again. No big deal. The other thing to know about incising is that depending on what texture you're carving, you might not have any line work or textured shapes on the surface. For example, honey is a round, smooth texture that wouldn't have any lines or incising. Now you know how to make pangolin scales. Congrats! How often are you really going to use a pangolin scale in your carvings? I don't know, maybe you love pangolins. But the point here is that you want to take what I've taught you and be able to apply it to whatever textures that you're going to create on your carvings. Let's take a moment to go through the entire texture carving process for 3 quick, I promise they'll be quick examples. My hope is that after watching a few wildly different textured carvings, that you will be able to figure out how to carve any texture you desire using the carving process that I'm teaching you. I have a scrap piece of clay, and instead of carving out a shape like we've done on our tiles, to save some time for this demo, I've just drawn a circle. I'm a bit of a lazy baby. I think I've told you guys that before. So just pretend with me that this circle is one of the shapes on your tile. In order to carve a texture onto this shape, I need to start with step 1. Observe my reference. This image of fur is made of wispy triangular clumps of hair. I can see each clump triangle is rather round and frayed at the edges. Each triangular clump is wide at the top and pointy at the bottom, and it makes the triangles appear to point downward in a rather curved way. But some clumps are skinnier than others, and all of the hair is pointing and moving downward. Alright, now that I've observed the shapes of my fur texture, it's time to draw those shapes onto my circle. Notice that I'm drawing thick and thin round triangles with a little bit of movement. The next step is to relief carve my shapes so that they pop out and become 3D. The smaller your shapes, the more difficult your carving will be, and the pointier your tools should be to help you get into those tight crevices. Here you can see that I'm carving out trenches around each shape. I'm slowly carving these shapes out so that I'm relying less and less on line and more on shadow. It's not perfect the whole time, and sometimes I lose my shadow, but then in areas that I lose that detail, I know I have to go back in there and recarve that detail deeper and deeper so that we can see the shadow. Remember, we're looking for shadow. And now that the shapes are 3D, it's already starting to make this look like fur. It's more three-dimensional. I've got the right shapes in all the right places. And now I've got to move on to the next step, adding movement. I round down the edges of the shapes so that the triangle clumps look softer and rounder like the reference photo. Now, I'm not going to be able to incise and draw every single little hair, but I want to carve some lines so that it gives the impression of hair. Fur is a texture that has a lot of line and movement. You can see here that I'm incising lines as thin as I am able with a sharp metal tip tool. My lines are running vertical in the same way that I have observed in my reference photo earlier, and now my fur looks hairy and 3D. Hooray! I have diligently shown you how I worked my way through all 5 steps of the carving process: observation, drawing shapes, relief carving those shapes, adding in movement, and incising the line details. Now I get students all the time who are lazy babies and they skip steps 1 through 4 and go straight to incising those lines. And because they didn't take the time to look at a reference photo, their line work looks more like crazy scribbles than hair. It's not even 3D. It's not very intentional. There's no shadow anywhere, and it looks awful. All it is line work, and they've done a poor job at that to boot. So when we're doing proper texture, we're going through all 5 steps. We observe our references, shapes, and lines. We draw out those shapes. We relief carve those shapes so that they are 3D and defined by shadow. We carve movement into our shapes so that our carvings are dynamic. And then, step 5, we incise the line details. Incising is intentional and strategic and must be observed in the reference. Do not skip steps 1 through 4 and then go straight to 5 and do it badly. You're killing me, kids. I'm telling you. Just take your time and do a good job. On to our second practice texture, slime. So notice I've got my reference image. I'm drawing all of the shapes of the slime. I'm carving out these shapes. I start with the trenches around the drip shapes. I'm using a sharp metal tip tool to get into all the little tight areas, and I'm making the slime drips look more 3D. First, it doesn't look great. It kind of looks like stair-steppy, but now I'm carving out the movement, making the slime look round and smooth. As I carve the soft gooey movement, if I lose a shadow, I go back in and carve deeper. Now for slime, I do not have any incising to do. It's kind of the opposite of incising. I need to smooth out all the round shapes. So I take care to really get the tight, smooth, rounded movement. It's also looking a little bit on the flat side, but I use a round ribbon tool to make all those round areas pop. I make sure that it's 3D and defined by shadow. To get the movement even more round and smooth, I go a step further and use a wet paintbrush to smooth my carving even more. Notice that I accidentally smoothed too much and I couldn't see my shadow, so I went back in and carved my shadow again. All right, our third example texture will be mushroom gills. Notice I have my reference photo at the ready. I observe all the lines of the gills and how they move toward the center in a radial manner. I also notice all the gills are skinny with deep trenches between them. On the outside of the mushroom are the smaller gills, and each gill looks a little different and in random shapes. I draw out my shapes and lines. I start relief carving the trenches on either side of each of my gills, creating a mountain effect. If my clay is too dry, these skinny gills are going to want to chip. If my clay is too wet, these skinny shapes will want to rip. Notice that I get my blow dryer out at a certain point because I was carving wet clay. Allowing the clay to harden a wee bit gives me a little bit more control. I went ahead and carved down the outer edges to create more movement. This will make the shape look rounder and more 3D. I continue carving out all the fine gills carefully. I take my time and carve down the left side of the ridge and then the right side of the ridge. I'm using a fine dental pick so that I can work inside these very skinny, tight areas. I use a soft, dry paintbrush to remove all the clay gunk as I go, And you might have noticed at this point that a lot of carving is just going forward 2 steps and then backward a step. And sometimes it can feel a little bit frustrating because you're kind of carving and then you have to smooth, and then that smoothing wipes out all the carving and you have to go back and carve, and then you carve some more and you get more gunk, and it's just like this repetitive process. But don't give up heart, you'll get there in the end. And in the end, I've got some nice gills. Notice that I don't need any incising on the gills either, so I skipped that step. I've now done 4 example carvings of 4 different textures for you: pangolin scales, slime, fur, and mushroom gills. They're all very different. The slime and gills are smooth and didn't require any incising or line work. The fur looks rougher with the hair incised in random ways, and the pangolin scales also have incised lines, but the lines seem rather measured and exact. How do you know if you need incising? How do you know what your shapes will be? It all starts with observing your reference. Don't forget it. Now, let's take a moment to see the 5 steps of the carving process go down on my tile. Last time we started with our line work and then relief carved out all the shapes so that we had clear planes visible with shadow. Remember that 3 of your shapes must have 3 different textures carved on them. Today I'm going to show you the carving process for each of my carved textures. Even though we already made our shapes 3D, when carving textures, we need to go all the way back to step 1, observe a reference photo. Step 1, I observe my coral images. I will need to use my own creativity to imagine how this long shape with a pinched waist could look like a coral texture. At first, I'm trying to observe different reference photos to see the major shapes of all the coral images. I'm trying to ignore all the small surface shapes that will be incised later and really trying to see the major shapes and movements so that I can carve the 3-dimensionality of my coral. But there aren't really any shapes that overlap each other, so I skip steps 2 and 3. I move on to step 4 and carve the movement. I decide to create soft hills that look smooth and round, almost like low rolling hills that pinch at the waist. And then step 5, I incise all the details. Now if you notice on this coral, the surface details are shapes and not lines like it was on the fur and pangolin scales. So I take the time to draw and then carve all the shapes that I will need to incise into the surface. I use a dotting tool with a ball tip to smooth out and meticulously clean my craftsmanship in those deep cavernous areas. And now I have a successful coral texture. Hooray! For the worm shapes, I observed my references, drew out the shapes, carved out those shapes so that they started to look 3D, and all the lines turned into 3D shapes. And then I carved down the edges so that they are round in movement like an earthworm. I made the choice to skip the incising details once again for the exact same reasons as I did with the feathers. It's getting a little overwhelming because I chose to carve so many textures on so small of shapes, and they are all so close together. For the feathers, I, number 1, observed my references. I noticed that the feathers overlap each other much like a fan. Number 2, I drew out my shapes. 3rd, I carved out those shapes. 4th, I carve a diagonal movement to the feathers to give it movement. And then, to be honest, I skipped step 5, incising the line work of the feathers. I made this decision because the area was so small and because I thought my tile was already kind of busy and overwhelming. I thought too much detail might actually be a bad look. And that's fine, I'm the artist, I get to decide. Now, it might feel like all your work here is done. You have 5 shapes, you have carved 3 different textures, but I would say that you still have 10 to 20% to go. You still need to clean everything up. Make sure all the clay gunk is gone. Use rubber tip tools and a wet paintbrush to smooth out your rough areas. Clean every surface of your tile and every little corner. Make sure that your sides and edges are smooth and clean. If you can still see your dotted line on the edges, smooth that away too. That looks bad, okay? Flip your tile over, clean and smooth the bottom. Carve your name on the back and make sure you smooth it out really, really good so that it won't scratch any tables you choose to display your tile on. Double check all of your shadows are visible, and then if you are one of my in-person students, come and show me your work and get permission to be finished before you start drawing out your tile. Once you get my permission, you can begin to slowly dry out your tile. I recommend a bag taco, 2 sides tucked in with 2 sides open to the air, and so that it will slowly dry out. You don't want to dry them out too quickly. Your tiles are skinny and so they run the risk of shrinking quickly, warping and then cracking. But eventually my tile is bone dry and I bisque fire it. Woohoo! It's a little warped and curled up in the skinnier carved areas, but not too bad. And that's all for this tutorial. If you'd like to see how I glaze this tile, tune in next time to part 6, where I teach you how to use an underglaze wash and glaze your tiles. Thanks for watching and happy day!